here today. Today I'm going to be talking about emotion regulation. And when I say emotion regulation, what I mean is a set of abilities that allows us to monitor, evaluate, and modify the intensity and duration of our emotional experiences. And this is an important topic because we know from research that our success in mastering these abilities is strongly predictive of our health, how our relationships with people around us, as well as our mental health. Okay. So in our culture, there's a popular belief that if we bottle up our emotions, that's really bad for us. Okay, so bottling up our emotions we might refer to as emotion suppression. And this is something that we actively do to inhibit the display of emotion when we're already feeling emotion. So I'm angry, but I'm bottling that up. But if you think about it, there's many times throughout the day, the course of the day, where it's actually really appropriate socially to suppress our emotion, right? So right now it's the time of year where we are going to holiday parties, we have to go to our relatives' houses, and there's going to be a lot of occasions where you should zip it and not say what you're feeling and not show what you're feeling. So if your overbearing aunt starts criticizing what you're wearing or something like that, it's probably best for the family to not express everything that you're feeling. So from time to time, it's really probably healthy and adaptive to suppress your emotion, but we know that also if people are chronically suppressing their emotion, habitually suppressing that, we believe that that's unhealthy. So there's this hydraulic model of emotion, this idea that if emotion is likened to a liquid flowing through a system, if you stop it up, what can happen is that the pressure and tension can build. You can get an explosion or an implosion. And the idea is that if you vent your emotions through expressing them, you can release some of that pressure and improve health. Okay, so this is actually a very common idea in Western philosophy, and we can hear this in some of Aristotle's ideas about catharsis or Freudian ideas about health and mental health. It's very pervasive. But on the other hand, there are other cultural traditions where, actually there are different values around what we should do with our emotions, how we should regulate our emotions. So you can see these East Asian proverbs that really highlight how sometimes it's actually very healthy and important to restrain your emotions. Okay, so it's important to down-regulate or modulate our emotional expression. And this is especially true when we think about, some of these proverbs suggest that if you openly display your emotion too much, you can actually run into problems, often problems with other people. And in East Asian cultures, there's often a really strong value placed on harmony, keeping harmony with others, and emotion expression. Too much emotion expression can run counter to that. So we have these different cultural ideals about how we should regulate our emotion. And we can sort of liken these cultural priorities to Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. Okay, so Kirk is this, highly emotional character. He's often sort of marshaling his crew as a leader with these open displays of emotion. Whereas Mr. Spock, actually, something that you might not know about Mr. Spock is that some people might think he doesn't have emotions to regulate or to suppress because he's Vulcan, but actually, he's only half Vulcan. And he's half, what? Half human, that's right. And the lore around Mr. Spock goes that at an early age, he decided that he was going to live a Vulcan lifestyle. So he was going to exert this effort and choose to suppress his human emotion and live a purely rational life. So Mr. Spock actually does use emotion suppression. So the question for me then becomes, or for us today becomes, is Kirk healthier or is Spock healthier? And so if we kind of think about emotion suppression as this inhibition of the expression of emotion when it is already elicited, this takes some energy. Okay, so you're already experiencing an emotion, but you're doing something to dampen it, to cover it up, to suppress it. And what are the health consequences of that? And we actually have a really nice literature, a lot of it coming from James Gross at Stanford University and Emily Butler, who was one of his students. We have this rich laboratory-based research about what happens to people when they suppress their emotions in the laboratory. And actually, one of the main things that they find is that when people actively use effort to suppress negative emotions, there's kind of an ironic effect where instead of reducing negative emotion, the negative emotion is prolonged and intensified. Okay, so that's an ironic kind of effect. Another thing, because it takes effort to reduce your display of emotion, this is thought to be a cognitive demand on you. So it draws attention away from other things that you're doing. Like if you're trying to interact with another person, but you're spending all this energy suppressing your own emotion display, this can make it so that it interferes with your interactions. You're not paying as much attention to what the other person is saying or doing or feeling. And actually, interactions can result in more ill will, more conflict, and people who are suppressing their emotions are described by others as less likable. So it can disrupt your social interactions. We also know that people who report habitually suppressing their emotions are also the same people who report higher levels of depressive and anxiety symptoms. And finally, very concerningly, a recent study just came out showing that people who say that they suppress their emotions are also at increased risk of premature death. All-cause mortality, but specifically cancer mortality and heart rate mortality. So that is, of course, a huge concern. So this seems relatively straightforward, right? Emotion suppression is bad, but what I actually want to talk to about today is, given that actually different cultural groups have different values and experiences with emotion suppression, is it possible that these emotion suppression effects are different depending on where you're from, depending on your background? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is an infographic by a Chinese artist named Liu Yang. And he's depicted in these figures anger as expressed in Germany versus anger as expressed in China. Okay? And this really illustrates to him sort of the transparent expression of anger in Germany, angry face, feeling angry inside, very transparent. In China, smile. I'm going to smile. I'm really mad, but I'm going to smile at you. I'm modulating my display of emotion. This is an artist who spent a lot of time both in Germany and in China, and he sort of depicted his observations. Now, these goals and emotion suppression are actually, we can think of them in cultural psychology as embedded within a larger set of cultural goals. Okay, so cultural psychologists talk about cultures that are oriented toward the interdependent self. East Asian cultures tend to be characterized this way, versus cultures that are oriented around an independent self. And they tend to be pursuing different goals. So in the West, in Western cultures, although our relationships are very important to us, some of the important goals that we value in life are to be unique, to express ourselves in our lives and in our relationships, to pursue goals that are personally meaningful to us, and to influence others toward those goals, often through direct communication. In contrast, we can think about in East Asian cultures, a focus on the self is very much intertwined with others. So not only are our relationships important, they're actually self-defining. And that's what we mean by the interdependent self. And here the goals that we pursue are, rather than to be unique, we want to fit in. Rather than to express our inner states, express ourselves, we might want to adjust ourselves to the social situation, to others. We might prioritize group goals over personal goals. And instead of sort of our main goal being to influence others, we might want to accommodate others. And finally, we might do so through indirect rather than direct communication. Okay, so and we can see how emotion expression would subserve the goals of the independent self, whereas the emotion suppression might subserve the goals of the interdependent self. Okay, so Now, there's lots of research evidence suggesting that there are major cultural differences in the likelihood that we're going to express or suppress emotion, and that some of these differences are apparent pretty early in life. So we sometimes do experiments with little kids. So this is an experiment. I can't show you the videos because they didn't sign a TEDx release, but I'll describe what we did. We bring in little kids to the lab, 3 to 5-year-olds, and we do things to elicit emotions in them. And then we see how expressive they are. So in this task, this is called the Impossible Green Circles task. And we ask them for 3.5 minutes to draw circles. And every time they draw a circle, we tell them, no, that's too pointy. Or, no, that's too round. No, that's too fat. We correct them every time. And what kind of emotion would this elicit in a 3-year-old? Anger, frustration, irritability, just sorrow sometimes. So you see a lot of emotionality from some kids, but we see differences across cultures where we see a lot more emotion expression in our European American samples as compared to Korean children in Korea. And Asian American children also express emotion less than European Americans, somewhere in between Asians in Asia and European Americans. So we see also parents tell us, parents of these 3 groups tell us that they teach their children to do different things with their emotions. So European American parents encourage their children to express emotion, and Asian parents tend not to as much. So these values are socialized early, and we see these differences quite early. Okay? And then in our research with adults, young adults in the laboratory, we actually see a lot of advantages that East Asian individuals have in summoning the ability to suppress their emotions. So we see laboratory findings that if we use EEG technology with Asian Americans, European Americans, bring them into the lab, do something emotional to them, but tell them to suppress their emotion, we see that Asian Americans have very efficient neural responding. So we see really localized, dissipated neural activity in the region when we would expect emotional arousal. We see a greater dissipated neural activity for Asian Americans compared to European Americans. If we measure heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, we see that Asian Americans have less physiological arousal when instructed to suppress as compared to European Americans. They report less subjective negative emotion when asked to suppress. And we see less interference in social interactions. So they seem less distracted by the need to suppress their emotions. So some people have taken this evidence to suggest that for Asian Americans, suppressing your emotions is not bad for you. You know, it's not bad for you. It's actually probably, they're just fine for you. On the other hand, I look at this data and it tells me that, not necessarily that it's healthy, but that Asian Americans are really good at it. So if you tell them to suppress, darn it, they can suppress. So these data to me tell me that Asian Americans are facile at emotion suppression. But I wanted to show you some data today that actually includes data that we've collected right here at Fountain Valley High School. Oh, Barons, right? And these are data. And the purpose of these data is to look at a cultural group that's relatively understudied. Today we're just going to look, even though we've collected data from European American adolescents, Vietnamese adolescents in Vietnam, as well as Vietnamese-American adolescents, I'm today just going to show you some data on Vietnamese-American adolescents. And we're going to look at the interview and survey data that we've collected, where we asked people about how they regulate their emotions. Do they suppress or express? And I want to ask the question, is this related to indicators of relationship quality or symptoms of depression and anxiety in ways that look like we would expect for European Americans? Or would it be that because emotion suppression is embedded within a broader set of cultural goals common in East Asia, would we see negative effects of emotion suppression offset? So that's the question we're pursuing today. So so here's the sort of the design of what we did in these analyses. We measured the extent to which people tell us that they use emotion suppression habitually to cope with stress. And we asked that in the fall. We come back 3 months later, and we asked about a lot of relationship variables. So we asked about peer relationships and relationships with parents. We wanted to know how much stress and conflict there was in those relationships. We also wanted to know how supported they feel in those relationships. And then we looked at emotional distress indicators of depression and anxiety. So if we thought, okay, and these are some of the questions that we use. So if we think that emotion regulation is a sort of one-size-fits-all kind of process across cultures, then we might suppose that emotion suppression would lead to increased distress and depression, anxiety. And one of the reasons why that might happen is because relationships become disrupted. I'm not expressing how I feel in my relationships. Maybe I feel misunderstood. Maybe I feel that people are not there for me. Maybe because I'm suppressing my emotions. Okay? And so maybe if it's true that emotion suppression looks unhealthy for everyone, then it might look like this for Vietnamese-Americans. In contrast, if we think that culture is an important context in which these emotion regulation processes play out, we might suppose that Vietnamese-Americans are very good at this. They have no problems associated with it. It doesn't hurt the relationship because, in fact, suppressing emotion maybe subserves a goal of maintaining harmony in relationships. So this is maybe an alternative hypothesis that says that there are going to be cultural differences in the outcomes associated with suppression. So what do we find? Any guesses? Do you think Vietnamese Americans are going to look kind of like the bad data for European Americans? Or do you think it'll be different because they're different culturally? Different culturally. Same. You're split. Okay. I ran these data this morning, or William, one of my graduate students, ran it this morning. This is kind of sad news, a little bit, in some respects, because we do see that Vietnamese Americans do report suppressing emotion more than their European American counterparts, and that's not surprising because that's what our data have told us before. But we have found that suppression is related to the same kind of negative outcomes for Vietnamese Americans as they are for European Americans. So we found that people, the teens who told us they suppressed their emotion more, reported more anxiety and depression 6 months later. And also that the people who reported suppressing more reported less supportive friendships, less supported relationships with their parents, and more strain and conflict with their parents. So it looked like maybe even though the suppression was trying to subserve a goal around harmony, the teens who suppressed more also felt more alienated in their relationships. And in fact, if we look at the relationship between suppression and emotional distress, it's fully explained by difficulties with parent-child relationships. So that's kind of a bummer, but what have we learned? So we learned today that emotion suppression in Western samples is generally related to poor health outcomes. We also talked about how suppression, though, is actually encouraged, common, and valued in many other cultures, including East Asian cultures. So that led us to this question then of, what are the costs? Are there different costs of emotion suppression across these cultural groups? The data that I just showed suggests maybe not. Maybe the effects are quite similar. When we leave the laboratory and we ask people about their real life relationships and their feelings over time, we see similar problems with that form of emotion regulation. These data are preliminary, and I actually kind of broke a rule. You're not really supposed to show data that are not yet peer-reviewed in the TEDx rules, but so don't tell anybody I did that. But I think so they're preliminary. We need to do more research. But I think the take-home message for you today is to reflect a little bit on what do you do with your emotions. Are you Captain Kirk, or are you a Mr. Spock? And then to ask yourself, how is that serving you? How is that serving you in your relationships with other people? And how is that serving you in terms of your overall sense of well-being? And so I think it's all time for a little bit of a gut check for us. Or are we doing the right things with our emotions? Thank you very much.